Now an extended 9 o'clock news with Michael Buerk.
Hardline communists have overthrown President Gorbachev and taken over the Soviet Union. The army has backed the coup. Hundreds of tanks are on the streets of Moscow tonight. Boris Yeltsin talks of a new reign of terror and calls for a general strike. Thousands take to the streets to demonstrate against the takeover. The new leaders declare a state of emergency. They say they're saving the country from national catastrophe. Gorbachev, they say, is overtired and sick. Reports say he's under house arrest. Good evening. The Soviet Union is back under the control of hardline communists tonight. They took over the country with the help of the army and the KGB before dawn this morning. They said the country had become ungovernable and was in mortal danger. There have been confrontations between demonstrators and tanks, but so far no reported bloodshed. Opposition to the coup is gathering around the president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin. He's said clouds of terror are gathering over the country. He's called for civil disobedience and a general strike. President Bush has called the coup a disturbing development and cut short his holiday to return to the White House. Of President Gorbachev, there is no firm news. Those who deposed him say he is overtired and resting. Others say he's under arrest at his holiday home in the Crimea. The news of his fall was broken by Moscow radio.
And now newsflash. According to the Article 1277 of the USSR Constitution, Vice President of the USSR Gennady Yanayev took office from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev because Gorbachev is unable to perform his presidential duties for health reasons.
Mr. Gorbachev appointed every one of the hardliners who led the coup against him. The new acting president is Gennady Yanayev, an obscure provincial official until Gorbachev picked him as a vice president he could trust last December. Valentin Pavlov is the man Gorbachev chose as his prime minister in January, but who ever since has attacked his attempts to rescue the Soviet economy. The heads of the three security services were in the plot. Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the defense minister, chosen by Mr. Gorbachev in 1987, but unhappy about cuts in the armed forces. Vladimir Khrushchev, the head of the KGB since 1988, who stepped up military and economic spying. The Interior Minister, head of the police, Boris Pugo, the man Gorbachev chose last year to fight corruption. And Oleg Baklanov, who oversees the defense ministry for the Communist Party and is a key figure in the Soviet Union's huge military-industrial complex. These are the men who ended the Gorbachev revolution.
The Soviet army is on the streets of Moscow, and the worst fears of supporters of democracy have now been realized. The men who say they've seized power in the Soviet Union have shown their true face this morning, relying not on the ballot box, but on the army. Columns of tanks have surrounded strategic buildings, meeting resistance from the Soviet people, resistance that so far has been largely token, but which nonetheless gives an indication of the violence and conflict which looks certain to spring from any organized opposition. The tanks were quick to gather at the Parliament of the Russian Federation. The strong contingent of radical MPs led by Boris Yeltsin were inside, trying to formulate a response to the military takeover. Yeltsin himself emerged dramatically to confront the besieging troops, to appeal to the army not to turn against the people, and to call for civil resistance to the men who'd ordered the tanks onto the streets.
Recent events have infuriated the hardliners, and that's why they're staging this irresponsible attempt to resolve political problems by the use of force. They're attempting a coup d'etat, But wherever my appeal for strikes is heard, the people are now backing it.
With the might of the Soviet army now surrounding Boris Yeltsin's Russian parliament, this military coup has become a depressing echo of the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. All three operations staged with the avowed intention of protecting socialism from a reformist regime. With Mr. Gorbachev under arrest, Boris Yeltsin has become the one rallying point for opposition to the hardliners. The question now is whether his vast popular support can provide any real challenge to the might of the military and the KGB. As Yeltsin's supporters responded to his call to defend the Russian parliament, the man who now carries the banner of liberal reform in the Soviet Union issued a statement declaring the self-proclaimed emergency committee illegal and cancelling its orders in the territory of his Russian Federation, saying the actions of the hardliners were returning the world to the Cold War and appealing to the army not to obey their orders. Despite the ban on demonstrations, several hundred Yeltsin supporters did gather outside the Kremlin, chanting no to fascism and calling for the reinstatement of the legal government. Yeltsin and Gorbachev pitched into an alliance that had previously seemed impossible, now united in the fight for democracy. A large military contingent in the side streets made no attempt to crush the demonstration, but bigger gatherings, as demanded by Yeltsin, may not be so fortunate. The army is reported to have told hospitals to expect casualties. The self-declared president, Gennady Yanayev, announced this afternoon that a state of emergency was being imposed in Moscow with a military commandant for the city. Similar measures are being introduced in Leningrad, and, said Yanayev, all except 9 specified newspapers would now be banned from publication, adding cynically that Mr. Gorbachev was now recovering his health at his holiday home and may one day return to his duties. Gennady Yanayev was, ironically, hand-picked by Mr. Gorbachev as a man the president said he could trust. But Yanayev is a hardline communist, schooled in the Marxist trade unions, and one of the men who've now become the not-so-human face of Soviet communism. When I spoke to him shortly before today's dramatic events, Yanayev told me communism was not dead, saying he would never forsake the ideal of the party, but hypocritically professing his loyalty to Gorbachev and to perestroika.
To begin with, I imagine you don't mean conflicts in the Soviet leadership, since the Soviet leadership has a full understanding of the fact that we are all traveling down the same path, and that there are no differences between the president, the vice president, and the prime minister. So my view is that both the President and the Supreme Soviet and the Vice President and the Prime Minister and all the key ministers are all pulling together as a single team, the team of perestroika, President Gorbachev's team, and there are no grounds for any other interpretation.
Soviet television and radio are continuing to repeat the announcement of the state of emergency, appealing to traditional values of patriotism and Soviet pride, condemning the policies of Mr. Gorbachev and offering populist measures like increased wages and frozen prices to win over public opinion, attempting to reassure the rest of the world that international commitments will be respected, but making clear that they now plan a return to the values of old-style orthodox communism. Interior Ministry troops around Moscow's TV tower have ensured that Boris Yeltsin's Russian television channel will not be able to broadcast any dissenting views. The old Soviet reaction to seize control of information, ending the flowering of glasnost.
It's a nightmare. Nobody's working. It's a state coup. There's no more union, no nothing. There's no more hope left.
Of course we were expecting it. Maybe things will get better, maybe worse, we don't know.
As with Nikita Khrushchev, the last man who tried to reform the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev seems to have been the victim of an archetypal palace coup, leaving for a summer holiday this month and finding that in his absence the apparatchiks have moved to seize power, even insisting on the fatuous reason of health problems for his removal. The intimidatory presence of troops on all the city streets, though, is proof that Mr. Gorbachev did not go willingly, and that his successors are bent on overturning his legacy of freedom and democracy. With Muscovites gathering to try to halt the advancing army, the scene is now set for possible confrontation. Much will depend on the popular response to Boris Yeltsin's appeals for civil resistance. Only if that response is strong and united will there be any remaining hope of defeating the hardliners. Recent warnings of impending dictatorship by liberals like Eduard Shevardnadze and Alexander Yakovlev have been borne out with a vengeance. Coming on the eve of a union treaty signing which would surrender power traditionally held by the communists and the centre, it's clear that the hardliners felt they had to strike quickly and decisively, leaving Mr. Shevardnadze today predicting a gloomy future for the country.
They considered that it is possible to run the country with tanks. Although it is stupid, it is pure adventurism and will lead to the flowing of blood. We can expect a repression.
Outside the Russian parliament this evening, Muscovites have begun a vigil to defend Boris Yeltsin and his government. Their makeshift barricades of planks and wire are unlikely to trouble the tanks if they come, but they're counting on the unarmed civilian presence and the eyes of the world's media to dissuade the new regime from attempting a frontal assault. The biggest cheer of the evening came with the announcement that an elite tank division had announced it would not follow the Kremlin's orders and may even come to help defend the parliament. The barricades on the streets of Moscow this evening are manned by supporters of democracy and freedom, desperately trying to defend the reforms of the Gorbachev era. It's all chillingly reminiscent of the scenes in the Baltic republics before the army moved in January. But the difference here is that Muscovites are not united. For every person on the barricades, there are hundreds of others ready to welcome the new regime if it can provide law and order and bread on the table. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
And you can see Martin Sixsmith's full interview with Gennady Yanayev, the new acting president of the Soviet Union, in Panorama immediately after this programme. Outside Moscow, the new leaders of the Soviet Union have moved quickly to try to quell opposition. Independent newspapers have been ordered not to publish, and most radio and TV stations have been shut down. The three Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, are now under the control of the army, and all local police and armed forces have been ordered to surrender their weapons. In the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, thousands of people have demonstrated outside parliament, but Soviet troops have taken over the Ministry of Communications, and in the second city, Kaunas, paratroopers have seized the television and radio centre. In Latvia, the communists have banned all other political parties and occupied the television headquarters. In Estonia, Swedish radio reports that Soviet troops have moved in to prevent any resistance. In Leningrad, a state of emergency has been declared. Troops have taken control of all broadcasts and all demonstrations have been banned. But supporters of Boris Yeltsin say most miners there, in Belarusia, the Ukraine, and in the area near his hometown of Sverdlovsk, have backed his call for widespread strikes. And in the southern republic of Azerbaijan, tanks have appeared on the streets of the capital Baku, according to the Iranian news agency IRNA.
According to Soviet television, there were no tanks to be seen today in Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city. A large crowd gathered, waiting for advice from a special meeting of the city council. It proclaimed solidarity with the defiant stance taken by Boris Yeltsin, but advised people to obey the orders of the KGB and Interior Ministry. In the Baltic republics, though, a more dramatic story. The Black Berets, special Soviet troops, repeated their June takeover of the Vilnius telephone exchange in Lithuania and seized other buildings as well. The Lithuanians added to the fortifications around their parliament building, defended only by lightly armed civil guards. Inside, President Vytautas Landsbergis broadcast an urgent appeal to the West.
Do not allow the tragedy of Budapest and Prague to repeat itself at the shores of the Baltic.
President Landsbergis called on his people to defend their parliament. A radio operator inside the building says tensions are running very high.
The situation is very, very dangerous. I think a lot of people may be killed. I expect it to be a battle after Vilnius, and this will probably happen this night.
And in Latvia, Soviet television claimed the capital, Riga, had been calm. It did not broadcast the fact that Soviet paratroopers took over and shut down Latvian television this afternoon.
The president of Georgia, one of the 6 Soviet republics which wants independence from Moscow, has made a television appeal to people to keep calm. There are around 300,000 Soviet troops based in Georgia, and a number of people have already been killed in clashes between the army and Georgian nationalists this year. From the capital, Tbilisi, Carol Walker reports.
Word spread quickly of the news from Moscow, and people began gathering outside the Georgian parliament building early this morning, trying to find out exactly what was happening. There's considerable tension here. Many predict the military coup will lead to immediate action to suppress Georgia's independence and force the republic to toe Moscow's line.
It will be very important if all the democratic forces of the Soviet Union will be united at this very moment, because it's not only Georgia, after all, which has suffered.
Well, Georgians will defend themselves. We'll fight for our freedom.
So far, there's no evidence of unusual military activity here, though rumors are rife. Some 300,000 Soviet troops are stationed in the republic. These Interior Ministry soldiers are along the border with South Ossetia, where there has been serious ethnic conflict in recent months. The South Ossetians oppose Georgia's independence. The republic's president, Zviad Gamsakhodia, called an emergency cabinet meeting and appealed for peace, order and discipline.
I appealed for peace and peaceful work for all, and not to react on provocations and be still.
Though Georgia's leadership showed little regard for President Gorbachev, the fear now is that there is far worse to come. The people here believe it is only a matter of time before steps are taken to crush Georgia's independence and that of the other republics who sought to break free from Moscow's control. The Georgian Orthodox Church has played a leading role in the independence movement here. Today, people thronged St. George's Church to pray for peace and freedom. Carol Walker, BBC News, Tbilisi, Georgia.
So, what were the internal forces that finally tilted against Mr. Gorbachev, and what is the shape of the balance of political power tonight? Mr. Gorbachev had come under increasing criticism for his handling of the Soviet Union's internal problems, and the Soviet Communist Party had become increasingly divided between hardline and radical factions. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Ben Brown reports.
Gorbachev's hardline critics in the Kremlin have frequently challenged his rule in the Communist Party Central Committee and elsewhere. Until now, though, they've only succeeded in driving out some of his key allies. Last December, Edvard Shevardnadze left office, prophetically warning of impending dictatorship. The Liberal Interior Minister, Vadim Bakatin, was forced out as well. Then, last month, came an indication that Gorbachev himself was now the target. A newspaper article appeared, signed by several prominent generals, and it called on the people to resist a leadership it accused of destroying the homeland and breaking Russia into two. The public face of the Communist Party Old Guard is the Soyuz group, which has consistently campaigned against Gorbachev. But behind the scenes in the Kremlin, the more important opponents were the men who've put their name to today's coup. Among them, the Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov, who always balked at the more radical reforms he was asked to implement. The Defense Minister, Dmitry Yazov, who, like his co-conspirators, was promoted by Gorbachev, but who now appears to have been plotting his downfall for some time. Critically, Yazov is in charge of the army. Indeed, he and his colleagues control all the country's security forces. Boris Pugo is in charge of the police and Interior Ministry troops, while Vladimir Khrushchev runs the KGB with some 700,000 staff under his command. So why did these men make their move today? Because tomorrow the new Union Treaty was due to be signed, giving significant powers to the republics and taking them away from Moscow. Tomorrow, some of the 9 republics which support the treaty were due to give their formal approval. The 6 others in the Soviet Union, including the Baltics, will not sign, but even so, the Old Guard were alarmed.
They saw the signature of a treaty which would give effective power in everything but defense, security and some aspects of economics to the republics as really the point of no return. So they decided to strike before that signature was actually made.
It was the reconciliation between Gorbachev and his old rival Boris Yeltsin which was behind the treaty's progress. Yeltsin is now the man radicals are hoping can do something to stop the hardliners. In the Russian Republic, at least, he enjoys overwhelming popular support, and already many Soviet miners have heeded his appeal for a general strike. What is not yet clear is whether the army which moved into Moscow today can be relied upon to suppress dissent. Some of its officers are in favor of reform, some against, and many of the ordinary troops are unwilling conscripts.
If the civilians come out into the streets and if they stay away from work and on strike, then the younger elements and the conscript elements in the army, I think, will find it'll be very difficult to get them to shoot their fellow citizens.
But in an attempt to buy the support of the long-suffering Soviet people, the new leadership have already promised to cut some prices and to raise wages. It's unlikely to be enough.
Within the last few minutes, we've received pictures of Soviet army tanks going to the Russian Parliament building to support Boris Yeltsin. The tanks from the elite Taman division south of Moscow have taken up positions in formation outside the Parliament, with their turrets pointing out towards the Moscow River. The crowds around the building where Boris Yeltsin is staying lifted barricades to allow them through. Our Foreign Affairs editor John Simpson has just arrived in Moscow. John, is there any evidence that the army is divided and that more troops and tanks may go over to Boris Yeltsin?
Well, it's difficult to tell at this stage. I think that each individual commander, I imagine under these circumstances, each commander, each officer really has to make up his own mind. It's so reminiscent, in fact, of the situation before the events in Tiananmen Square, the shootings in Tiananmen Square, when the army was not fully agreed and couldn't actually, the government wasn't able always to make it do what it wanted and had to search around for military people who were prepared to do what they wanted. As we know, Deng Xiaoping eventually found somebody to do what he wanted. It remains to be seen whether the authorities here can do that. I've been myself to see in the past, to see the headquarters of the Tamanskaya tank division. A year ago I went to see them when, ironically, there was a rumor that they were going to stage a coup themselves. Now, they assured me at the time they had no intention of doing it. They wanted to stay with the people, as they said it, as the commanding officer said it. Now it seems that they've actually really done what they said they were going to do. John, you've driven through the streets of Moscow tonight. Briefly, what did you see? Very gloomy, very depressed, very dark. Of course, it is actually nowadays very gloomy in the evenings in Moscow anyway, so perhaps that isn't really a sign. But on the outskirts of the city centre, I came across about 12 tanks, light tanks, by the side of the road. I went over, spoke to the people from a distance, and got nothing very much out of them, except that they seemed to be indicating that they weren't armed, or at least they were armed, but they had no ammunition with their guns, those of them who had guns. They seemed to be very bored, depressed, and slightly nervous and embarrassed, I felt, but it really was a slight meeting, a very short one. And then everywhere you see in the centre of the city, you see the police on the street corners and police cars stopping people going down to the centre and so forth. A depressing picture. John Simpson, thanks very much indeed. Unconfirmed reports tonight say that Mr. Gorbachev has been taken by helicopter from his holiday home to a military base at Sebastopol in the Crimea, a prisoner after his years of power. He became Soviet leader in March 1985, succeeding 3 old and ailing Soviet leaders who died in the previous 3 years: Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. He set out to transform Soviet society and end 4 decades of Cold War confrontation. This assessment of the Gorbachev years from Brian Hanrahan.
It took 3 funerals in 3 years before the old men who controlled the Soviet Union were willing to risk giving the leadership to Mikhail Gorbachev, then 54. Death had given him charge of a decaying system, but nobody knew just how rotten it was or could foresee the wholesale changes he would make. His early days were dynamic. He got out on the streets, called for harder work, offered incentives. The people were impressed.
А что думают ленинградцы о нашей политике? Как мы шаги в правильном направлении делаем или нет? Правильно. Ну куда ж ближе?
At last they had a leader who could talk without notes and walk without help. They had little else to be proud of. His first campaign against Russia's endemic alcoholism was unpopular and largely ineffective. The Soviet economy needed fundamental overhaul, tinkering with superficial problems wouldn't work. To rescue Soviet industry and Soviet society from what he called Brezhnev's era of stagnation, he produced new policies. Glasnost and then perestroika became catchwords around the world. The Soviet Union was opened up to debate and criticism. But still, there was suspicion of a state that ruled through arbitrary power. The release of the country's most famous dissident, Andrei Sakharov, kick-started a faltering reform process. It was the first of many of Mr. Gorbachev's gambles as he overruled his conservative colleagues, but it paid off. Liberals at home began to believe in change. The world started to trust the Soviet leader to deliver results. It's hard to recall just how startling it was when Ronald Reagan first met Mr. Gorbachev. For years, the two countries had been glowering at each other, threatening nuclear destruction. Now, the personable General Secretary of the Communist Party was matching the old actor in public relations and had a crowd-pleasing wife. But when they met in Reykjavik, Mr. Gorbachev stunned Mr. Reagan with the scale of his disarmament proposals. The Soviet leader knew he had to cut military spending to save his country from bankruptcy. But the American president just wasn't yet ready to believe him. Trust took time to build. It needed 2 years of patient negotiating before they were ready to sign the first major treaty, abolishing medium-range nuclear missiles. As the weapons were being destroyed, Mr. Gorbachev was throwing out yet more proposals. He was offering to withdraw troops and tanks from Eastern Europe to scale down global confrontation. American inspectors were allowed to poke about in secret Soviet installations. Mr. Gorbachev based his foreign policy not on class struggle, but on mutual benefit. It was the first piece of Marxist dogma to be conspicuously jettisoned. Nowhere in Mr. Gorbachev's personal history is there any hint of the momentous changes he's to bring about. He was born on a farm when Stalin's policy of collectivization was in full swing. He grew up surrounded by the relentless propaganda of the communist state and accustomed to the cruelties inflicted on its opponents. His father was a farm manager, which means a firm supporter of the system, and little Misha had a model communist upbringing. His mother still lives in the same small village in southern Russia. She says for 3 months he missed school because they were too poor to buy shoes, but he quickly caught up. As the young Gorbachev progressed through school, here he's on the right edge of the photo, he was considered diligent rather than brilliant. But as he went through the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, and on up the career ladder of a communist bureaucrat, he developed a great capacity for argument and a command of detail. He ended up as a regional party boss, mixing his own ideas on how to keep the workers happy with slavish praise of Brezhnev's pet farming schemes. Gorbachev's domain included a pretty spa town, popular with many of the country's leaders. It brought him to Brezhnev's attention, who promoted this agreeable young man to the ruling Politburo. By now, the Politburo was virtually sleepwalking, continuing past policies uncritically. But Mr. Gorbachev revealed his unease when he recalled the night before he was elected leader.
3 часа я вернулся. И вот ночью мы ходим с Раисой Максимовной.
3 часа?
3 часа ночи. Я говорю, знаешь, я вижу, чувствую по всему, что могут мне предложить. Тогда я вот сказал, собственно, что так жить дальше нельзя. Надо менять. Это чтобы надо менять, видимо, надо, если будет сказано так, и воля будет других товарищей по партии, соглашаться.
Mr. Gorbachev's new order was most spectacularly demonstrated by the Soviet army's withdrawal from Afghanistan. It staunched what Mr. Gorbachev called a bleeding wound, removed a source of international friction, and suggested he had the army firmly under control. The West was swept by a wave of adulation which reached its height in West Germany. Gorby mania stampeded people and politicians alike. For a time, it seemed he could do no wrong. It flowed on through China, where students used his presence to fill Tiananmen Square and condemn communist rule. Mr. Gorbachev had come to heal the 30-year rift between the two great communist powers. But Deng Xiaoping did not relish his style of political reform. The massacre that followed raised the question, would Mr. Gorbachev have anything to do with the Chinese-style solution? When he went to see East Germany's Erich Honecker, he made clear the answer was no. He told them they were on their own. When crowds stormed the Berlin Wall, Soviet troops were confined to barracks. The Brezhnev doctrine of protecting socialism was replaced by the Sinatra doctrine. In a memorable quip, Gorbachev's spokesman said, They do it their way. Back home, there were also demands for liberation. The Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Georgians, the Armenians, the Moldavians all asked why they couldn't be allowed self-determination too. The authority of the central government was collapsing. Mr. Gorbachev extemporized brilliantly as he tried to keep reform on the agenda. He changed the constitution, removed the communist right to govern, introduced democracy. He was trying to make the Soviet Union a society governed by laws instead of a shadowy dictatorship. But he was often unfairly accused of being a dictator himself.
У нас власти было больше. Я не знаю, у кого в мире было больше власти, чем у генерального секретаря ЦК. И если бы мне только нужно, не надо никаких реформ.
His political brilliance, though, was dulled by economic incompetence. Nothing would make the economy work, and the people got hungry and angry. The Soviet leader was forced to give ground to the right-wingers. They took key positions and gave the Lithuanians a taste of what a return to authoritarian rule would mean when they tried to crush Lithuania's bid for independence with tanks and Kalashnikovs. The result was a standoff between left and right, which left Mr. Gorbachev isolated, abandoned by his allies. In his 6 years, Mr. Gorbachev had shown the Soviet Union its problems, but not the solutions. And his laws have not protected him from the passions he's let loose.
And now to how the world has reacted to the fall of the man who changed the face of a military superpower. President Bush responded to the overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by cutting short his holiday and flying back to the White House to talk through his options with senior aides. Despite the coup, he's still describing Mr. Gorbachev as the best hope for the future of the Soviet Union. From Washington, Justin Webb reports.
It was his first public appearance since the fall of the Soviet leader, and President Bush was apparently determined to radiate calm, pausing outside the conference room to chat about the bad weather. Inside, the president said the news from Moscow was momentous and stunning, but there would be no hasty words or actions from him.
We're not going to overexcite the American people or the world, and so we will conduct our diplomacy in a prudent fashion, not driven by excess, not driven by extreme.
Even without President Gorbachev, Mr. Bush seemed to hold out some hope that Soviet reformers would still have a role to play.
It's also important to know that coups can fail. They can take over at first, and then they run up against the will of the people. So it's too early to say, but let's hope that Yanayev, when he made his statement, was speaking from conviction. His statement being that this will not mean setting back, as I understand it, setting back reform and commitment to go forward.
The president was met by Mr. Yanayev at Moscow airport 3 weeks ago when he arrived for the superpower summit. Mr. Bush said today Yanayev seemed then to have a certain commitment to reform, a view strongly endorsed by the Soviet ambassador to Washington, who told the State Department this afternoon that his new masters wanted to continue with reforms and good relations with America. Nevertheless, the mood in American political circles is gloomy, with commentators paying particular attention to the task of making sure Eastern Europe remains free.
Our primary task is to tie Eastern Europe to the West as rapidly as we can, so that there is a political obstacle to the return of Soviet powers.
The president, back at the White House now, is facing growing pressure to take a tough stance. This evening, he will consider all his options post-Gorbachev. Justin Webb, BBC News, Washington.
The British government is imposing economic sanctions against the Soviet Union. A special meeting of cabinet ministers in Downing Street this afternoon decided to scrap a £50 million aid package, and Britain will press European partners to do the same. Earlier, the Prime Minister John Major condemned the coup as an unconstitutional seizure of power and called it a very ominous development indeed. The Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, said he wanted early evidence that the leaders of the coup would continue the courageous reforms introduced by Mr. Gorbachev.
Downing Street officials told John Major at 5 o'clock this morning that Mikhail Gorbachev had been deposed. As news reached the West that the Soviet army had backed the coup and that Mr. Gorbachev was under house arrest, the Prime Minister emerged from number 10 to express his anxiety.
Events overnight are clearly a very ominous development indeed. There seems little doubt that President Gorbachev has been removed from power by an unconstitutional seizure of power. There are constitutional ways of removing the President of the Soviet Union. They have not been used.
As news spread, crowds gathered at the end of Downing Street, and Mr. Major insisted that whoever governs from Moscow should abide by existing agreements, not least on arms reductions.
That we will expect the Soviet Union to respect and honor all those commitments that President Gorbachev has made on its behalf.
The Prime Minister left to consult President Bush, President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl. There was talk of an emergency European heads of government meeting. The Foreign Secretary arrived, having broken off his holiday. Then the Defence Secretary, who's used the end of the Cold War to justify British defence cuts. And Trade and Treasury Ministers were on hand to advise on the implications for Western economies and the possibility of sanctions against Moscow should human rights be swept aside. From opposition parties, condemnation and demands.
We have to make clear that Gorbachev had our support and that we want the Gorbachev policies to continue, if possible, with the return of Gorbachev.
Europe must get its act together and speak with a single voice. It must do everything that it can in order to encourage the maintenance of the progress towards democracy internally and the progress towards a more peaceful world externally.
Margaret Thatcher, who as Prime Minister said she could do business with Mr. Gorbachev, urged the Soviet people to take to the streets to resist the hardliners. And she questioned Mr. Major's insistence that British defence cuts need not be reversed.
Those cuts which were going to be implemented should not be implemented now. We must pause to see what happens.
John Major's description of what's happened in Moscow, ominous and unconstitutional, amounts to a public condemnation, a response stripped of all diplomatic niceties. There's no doubting the Prime Minister's concern. But the British government, the West generally, now have no choice but to sit and await developments in Moscow. In the meantime, they're demanding that any new leadership should honour all that Mikhail Gorbachev stood for, but frankly, more in hope than expectation. That doesn't imply inaction. As the Soviet ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office, Britain halted £50 million worth of aid to Moscow, and the European community will tighten the diplomatic screw tomorrow. The aim, Mr. Major stressed this evening, was to protect Mr. Gorbachev's reforms.
It's in the West's interest to see reform. Whether it happens, we must wait and see. The omens at the moment are not propitious.
Not optimistic then, following what he called an old-fashioned coup in Moscow.
Stock markets around the world fell sharply as dealers reacted to the day's events. Billions of pounds were wiped off share prices. In London, the 100 share index closed down 80.5 at 2540.5. On the foreign exchanges, the pound was down against the dollar, but up 4 points against the German mark. The commander of Soviet forces in Germany has said his troops will keep to their promise to complete their withdrawal. President Gorbachev had promised that would happen by 1994. The Germans are afraid that the troops may stay. Today, Chancellor Kohl pointedly stopped short of denouncing the new regime. Our Europe reporter, Jonathan Charles, looks at reaction in the country that has benefited more from the Gorbachev era than any other.
Soviet troops in eastern Germany, their continuing presence now causing greater concern after today's sudden turn of events. There are 273,000 troops here, a legacy of the Cold War. All are due to leave by 1994, a promise made by Mikhail Gorbachev. Senior Soviet officers moved quickly this evening to give assurances the withdrawal would still take place. But leading German politicians are worried about the Soviet bases.
Up to 1994, I hope that there will be no any crisis with the troops in Germany. I want my German people, the citizens of Germany, not to have any conflict with the young soldiers of Soviet Union. They are not responsible for the new political cause, you know.
But the first signs of discontent have already come from the citizens of what was once communist East Germany. They demonstrated outside the offices of the Soviet embassy in Berlin today, calling for the return of President Gorbachev. Among the protesters were many of those who led the 1989 revolution. Aware of the rising tension, Chancellor Kohl returned by helicopter to Bonn, interrupting his Austrian holiday. For him, the departure of Mikhail Gorbachev is a personal blow. The two men had worked hard to build a special relationship. And at a news conference, the Chancellor said he was calling on the new Soviet leadership to guarantee Mr. Gorbachev's safety. Chancellor Kohl said he also wanted the Soviets to abide by all international treaties and respect human rights. He said he'd agreed the approach with President Bush and Prime Minister Major. In Bonn, there's a belief that Germany may be able to act as an intermediary between Moscow and the West, cutting off £10 billion of financial aid if agreement can't be reached. For most Germans tonight, though, the unification celebrations last October will be uppermost in their minds. Without Mikhail Gorbachev, it wouldn't have happened. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, Bonn.
Libya, Iraq and the Palestine Liberation Organization have welcomed Mr. Gorbachev's fall from power. The Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, called it a magnificent act. But East European leaders are worried about the risks for their new democracies. The Polish President Lech Wałęsa called for calm. Czechoslovakia's President Václav Havel said he was reminded of the suppression of democracy in Prague over 20 years ago. NATO has warned of serious consequences if the Soviet Union abandons the path of reform. It said the new leadership was expected to honour international commitments.
At NATO headquarters in Brussels, the countries of the Western Alliance have long wrestled with the dilemma of how to support Mr. Gorbachev's reforms while not banking too much on him personally. Even as the Soviet Chief of Staff was entertained there last year, analysts were warning of the risk of a hardline takeover just as Western nations were cutting their defences. Today, NATO ambassadors met in emergency session. Gorbachev had often seized the arms control initiative from them in the past. Now his downfall had done so again.
The Allies are deeply concerned that the latest developments foreshadow a grave deviation from the path of reform and the rule of law in the Soviet Union.
The withdrawal of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe will be most closely watched now. Though Moscow's new leadership has promised to observe international treaties, there was cheating on tank numbers even under Mr. Gorbachev. The British assessment, nonetheless, is that it is safe to continue to make cuts. But although all Soviet troops have left Hungary and Czechoslovakia, there are still 290,000 in Germany and another 45,000 in Poland. It's left many in Eastern Europe nervous about the future. The Czech President, Václav Havel, declared today that his country was in no immediate danger, but its borders will be reinforced even so. Hungary is uncomfortable as well.
The Soviet Union is still a military superpower, so the implications we have to take into considerations, and this could be negative.
President Mitterrand of France says the West's reaction should depend on the treatment of Mikhail Gorbachev and of Boris Yeltsin. He quoted tonight from a letter from Gennady Yanayev promising Gorbachev was in perfect safety. Though last month's G7 summit in London offered Mr. Gorbachev only limited help, even that will be on hold till the new leader shows his colours.
I spoke to our correspondent in Moscow, Martin Sixsmith, a few minutes ago and asked him whether the new leadership itself would be able to hold on to power.
The key factor is the army. The new regime does control the army. If the army stays together and stays behind the regime, and if there's no wave of public opposition to the new authorities, then they can hold on to power. If the army begins to fall apart, if there is a wave of public opposition, then they could have problems remaining in power. The next 2 or 3 days will be decisive.
Boris Yeltsin says he's taken command in Russia and he's ordered troops and KGB people to stand down. Is this just bravado?
It's an attempt to assert his authority. He knows that the apparat, the bureaucracy, the army and the security apparatus is likely to remain loyal to the Kremlin. What he is trying to do is sow the seeds of doubt in their minds to try and provoke the split that he needs if he's going to have any real chance of remaining in power.
And now a quick look at the rest of today's news. There's been continued fighting in the Yugoslav Republic of Croatia. 2 bombs exploded in the capital, Zagreb. Despite substantial damage, there were no injuries. In Pakrac, clashes have taken place throughout the day. And in Okučani, fighting has also been reported. At least 21 people died there during the weekend in some of the worst breaches of the ceasefire. Roads have been blocked to prevent federal troops taking in men and equipment. Britons working in Turkey are being urged to be vigilant following the murder of a British businessman today. Andrew Blake, who was employed by the Commercial Union Insurance Company, was shot as he arrived for work in Istanbul. Responsibility for the murder has allegedly been admitted in phone calls on behalf of 2 separate terrorist groups. The two men ordered to leave Ireland by the IRA have spent their third day in Newry's Catholic Cathedral. Liam Cairns and David Madigan sought sanctuary after the IRA threatened them with military action for alleged antisocial behaviour. The two men deny the accusations and say they'll stay in the cathedral until the threats are lifted. The licence to run a nationwide commercial radio station has been provisionally awarded to Classic FM. The franchise had originally been given to First National Radio, but the company failed to raise sufficient funds. Classic FM now has 6 weeks to find enough money for its licence to be confirmed. And the news of the day. Hardline communists have overthrown President Gorbachev and taken over the Soviet Union. From the 9 o'clock news, good night.
Good evening from Newsroom Southeast. Retailers in the region face a gloomy autumn, according to a new report from the CBI. It says that the worst of the fall in sales appears to be over. Last month's retail sales figures showed a slight increase. But the report says the recession is still keeping shoppers away.
The retail trade will be looking very closely at what happens in the run-up to Christmas. It's a key time. A lot of retail spending takes place over that period. And I think that'll be a testing ground for whether consumer confidence has yet returned. I don't think we'll be able to say that until we get much closer to the time.
Commuters in Essex have reacted angrily to news that British Rail may have to close their London terminal at Fenchurch Street. The station may be temporarily closed unless safety measures have been introduced by October. If the closure goes ahead, over 35,000 passengers a day will be forced to terminate their journeys 10 miles from the city and travel in by tube.
Many of us would be forced to get onto the underground at Barking, which is already very overcrowded. It would add a lot of time to our journeys. And we think in the evening at Tower Hill it would mean special crowd control procedures to cope with the number of people.
In the last half hour, police divers have found the body of a young boy in a North London reservoir. The ambulance and fire services were called to Lockwood Reservoir in Chingford this afternoon after a member of the public reported seeing a child fall into the water. North West Thames and North East Thames regional health authorities are to receive £14 million in loans as part of a government package aimed at reducing the numbers of mentally ill people on the streets. The money will help the authorities transfer patients from outdated asylums to community care and will be repaid from the sale of the old hospital sites. That's it from us, but your BBC local radio station is on the air till midnight. Now let's have a look at the weather forecast. Good evening.
Good evening. Well, anything between 11 and 13 hours of sunshine along the south coast today. Further north, a lot more cloud, and it's continuing to stream in from the Atlantic all the time. In fact, buried underneath all that cloud, there is a little low pressure area. I think that's just going to skirt in close to the northwest of Scotland overnight, bringing some rather wet and quite windy weather there for a time. The second weather front, well, that's really dragging its heels as it moves south, and it's beginning to break up all the time, but still enough to give some patchy rain over parts of the North Midlands and close in to the Wash. If anything, that cloud will continue to move southwards overnight, breaking up further. Probably by the end of the night, still a thick enough cloud close to the hills of the southwest and South Wales to give a little bit of mist and fog and some drizzle and rain too. Getting misty at the same time over northern England and parts of southern Scotland. As already mentioned, some rather more in the way of rain coming into the northwest of Scotland and towards the Northern Isles by the end of the night. Quite a fresh night over the northern half of the country, but quite muggy over central and southern parts of both England and Wales. However, for many of us, it's going to be a lovely day tomorrow. Probably starting off rather cloudy in some of these more southern areas, and indeed a lot of low cloud around the Western Isles. But even here, I think later on in the day it's likely to break up, and we'll see some better, sunnier weather coming through, with sunshine on and off for most of us throughout the day. Windy in the far northwest, but just light sea breezes around both the English and Welsh coasts, making for quite a pleasant day all in all. And temperatures getting quite high, maybe peaking 24 or 25 in the south, and many areas, central and eastern England, Wales and Scotland, up above 21 or 70. Now, if anything, it's going to get even hotter in the next few days, but as that warmer air shown by the orange begins to move northwards, it'll bring an increasing threat of thundery weather during Wednesday. Fresher weather out beyond this weather front, shown by the green area, will act as a trigger as that moves in during Thursday, setting off more in the way of thundery weather over central and eastern areas before the fresher stuff gets to us all by Friday.
BBC One's hot favourite for the weekend enters the glamorous horse racing world of Trainer.
I've never known an owner so desperate to win. It's an obsession.
He and Hugo ought to make a good pair then.
Racing's racing. There's no such thing as a certainty.
I think I'll stick with Happy Brave. Wrong? Pity.
As they come towards the line now. If you want to pull a stunt like that, put your reputation on the line, that's up to you, but don't do it with mine.
Trainer, a new series, under starters' orders for Sunday on BBC One.
Back to tonight now, and as we shall be running late because of the extended news, Law and Order will now begin at 10:30.